The young ones these days love to talk about the Sakuga bliss that is a core part of the modern battle shonen anime. No doubt, anime like Demon Slayer and Jujutsu Kaisen are topping the charts, ushering in a new generation of fans who will continue to upload the legacy of their predecessors and have zero riz. However, even the massive impact of the modern classics does not hold a candle to the original Big Three. For those new to weeb culture, the Big Three are a trilogy of anime that dominated the charts for decades in the early 2000s, before the fancy animation became the norm. In fact, they drew inspiration from series that had run their course and refined the skeletal framework into the now widely popular battle shonen formula. Yes, these shows established the themes of friendship, long-spanning adventures, and life lessons that have resonated with so many of us over the years. The Big Three include One Piece, Naruto, and Bleach. If you have watched more than 2 videos on this channel, you know that I love to glaze One Piece into oblivion. But that is actually backed by pseudoscience that I conjured up due to unemployment. Jokes aside, I am not some filthy casual who praises whatever series is trending that week, and a strong narrative is quite central to my enjoyment of any piece of media I consume. So I thought it would be fun to talk about why One Piece was destined to be the best among the Big Three, a hero among heroes. Some of you might think that it was sheer luck that Oda-sensei's series garnered more hype than Naruto and Bleach, but there are some very intentional nuances at play that I will be talking about today. This is not a video about personal preferences, and as always, all of you are free to unapologetically gush over whichever show you like best. I simply wish to nerd out about the narrative formula at play here. With all that out of the way, let's get to it. So, what is the narrative structure I keep rambling on about? Simply put, it's Oda's masterful storytelling that is architected decades ahead of its time. Many of the early character interactions serve as setups for important future events, like the seeds of the Void Century being planted early on in the show. Characters who take their leave make sure to re-enter the story with pizzazz, so every minor interaction begins to carry some weight. For example, the moving story of Laboon the Whale for when the crew enters the Grand Line is brought back during Thriller Bark when Brook joins the crew. Every single arc plays into a grander scheme of global politics, and Oda-sensei is constantly writing towards a pre-planned ending. This cause and effect format of storytelling is the engine for One Piece, and not the typical power escalation we are all too familiar with. On that note, Naruto draws its narrative strength from fleshed-out characters and their respective arcs, like Pain, Itachi, and the GOAT, Shishui. However, the most influential ninja war arc was full of bloat, retcons, and senseless villain escalation. On the other hand, I was obsessed with Bleach, but it is no secret that it peaked during the Soul Society arc, with phenomenal pacing and stakes. Later on, the editorial cuts and mismanaged plot threads ruined the series. Both Naruto and Bleach built a good momentum arc by arc, only to collapse, while One Piece built a saga for the masses to enjoy. Now let's talk a bit about the world building and setting of each of the Big Three, because the creative choices are like night and day, most certainly playing a part in which one people are more attracted to. One Piece handles world building masterfully, truly making the story feel like one on a greater scale. Each subplot and group moves independently of the Straw Hats, like the Marines and Yonko tensions, each island's unique culture, and even the deeper lore like the Void Century, Revolutionaries, and the Poneglyphs and ancient weapons. Once you stop and consider how taxing it is to create a different culture, religion, and economic system for every island and organization, you cannot help but love Oda a bit more. If we take a look at Naruto, the clan systems are well-formed and undoubtedly diverse. The geopolitics are pretty sound too, like the Akatsuki's influence on the villages and the tension between the Sand Village and the Hidden Leaf. However, all of it is much more centralized, making it less varied and smaller. On that note, Bleach has an amazing aesthetic and structure, all the way up until the disappointing latter arcs. But Kubo makes the world feel bland and less lived in, which some may argue is an artistic choice with the Shinigami and themes of death. At the end of the day though, One Piece is just grander and deeper in scale and setting. Moving on, let's talk about maybe the top reason One Piece is so dear to me, and that is how sensitively and maturely a lot of the darker themes in the show are handled. When I experienced Nami's backstory and breakdown in Arlong Park for the first time, I knew that this was a different beast from the other battle shonen out there. At the time of its serialization, covering such dark topics and actually executing them well was a feat unheard of in shonen, to say the least. Oda takes his time and lets the reader take an immersive dive into the brutality of segregation and racism during the Arlong and Fishman arc. But that is just the beginning. As I mentioned earlier, every plot device feeds into something bigger. Once his bold risk of inclusion paid off, Oda went on to write about genocide, slavery, mental health, and government censorship, without it ever feeling like an out-of-place lecture or virtue signaling. The tonal balance between a cliché, goofy exterior paired with a devastating core that entertains and informs is really hard to pull off. Even the stereotypical naive hope slowly crumbles before us, and systemic evil is portrayed instead of individual villains of the week. Now, Naruto and Bleach greatly raise the stakes and cover serious themes too, but execution is where they lack. Perhaps in an attempt to make the content digestible for young readers and viewers. I was actually quite impressed by how Naruto handled themes of generational hatred, war trauma, child soldiers, and unending cycles of violence with surpassing nuance, but it also dampened a ton of pain with the over-themed talk no jutsu, taking away from the immersion. Bleach also did a good job of exploring themes of identity, self-discovery, and loneliness in, dare I say, one of the most subtly stylish ways ever, but it shies away from deep social critique, even though the hierarchy and institutional flaws in the series were a goldmine of content. Therefore, all shows do a good job of staying in their lane and talking about prominent themes, but One Piece manages to be consistent and much more comprehensive. Another thing I absolutely admire about One Piece that Naruto and Bleach fail to pull off is the sheer tonal range of the expansive world. By introducing the concept of varying islands in the Grand Line, Oda can create vibrant, diverse settings that span a plethora of genres. I mean, which other show goes from a comedy battle shonen to a tragic drama to a political thriller to a horror to a samurai epic to a... Okay, I'll stop now. But you get the point. It feels like a bunch of shows with an overarching plot stitched together seamlessly, and in a world where adventure frames everything, Oda is free to switch tones while maintaining emotional continuity. Want the Straw Hats in a creepy Scooby-Doo-esque mansion? Thriller Bark. Prison Break? Impel Down. Want to return to the basics and watch a pirate war? Marine Ford. There is something for everyone, and I think that's beautiful. Every genre feels like an addition to the expansive world instead of an abandoned idea with haphazard execution. On the flip side, both Naruto and Bleach are very strong in their respective genres of ninja military fantasy and supernatural urban gothic action, but they are way less fluid compared to One Piece's constant reinvention. That seems like a calculated recipe for success, ensuring more people find something to resonate with in the series. Okay, so we have talked plenty about the world building of the big three, but what about the actual characters themselves? Well, One Piece again does a brilliant job of keeping characters relatable, relevant, and ridiculously cool. See, power is not the main goal here, like typical battle shonen. All of the Straw Hats are complex trauma survivors with their own demons to face, which happens through slow and believable growth. The character-centric arcs go all in, like Robin in Enies Lobby or Nami in Arlong Park, focusing on themes of healing and freedom across hundreds of chapters. Moreover, the side characters are constantly reintroduced and made to feel relevant. Naruto, on the other hand, thrives at tragic antagonists with fleshed-out backstories like Itachi and Obito. In addition to generational hatred and trauma, Bleach takes a more personal introspective look at feelings of isolation and identity, explored via a very cool and stylistic approach, especially with characters like Okuiora and Ichigo. However, a massive chunk of the cast is underutilized, with several characters stalling plot development and acting like a speed bump. Again, One Piece's consistency pays off. Next, let's take a look at the power scaling and the fight philosophy of each show, which I'm sure a lot of you were waiting for. In a lot of ways, One Piece's power system with the Devil Fruits and Haki reminds me of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Most of the battles depend on creativity and technique mastery instead of raw power, which is always refreshing to see in anime. Reality seems to bend to willpower, and the abilities are consistent with the deeper themes of the show, like how Sun God Nika is the embodiment of freedom and agency. I do agree, plot armor plays a role often in how some fights play out, but by avoiding a numeric and linear power system and letting hacks and tactics win, One Piece manages to stay fresh. Nearly all battle shonen out there are guilty of using hacks mode as plot armor, so I won't dog too much about both Naruto and Bleach. While Naruto's power system started really strong with how chakra was directly tied to strategy, it eventually devolved into a flurry of god-level beam wars that take away from entertainment and consistency. For the record, I was a big fan of Bleach before the Aizen arc left a bad taste in my mouth, and the powers are very cool and metaphysical. However, That is the biggest weakness too, since most abilities are loosely defined and driven by Deus Ex Machina ability. Undoubtedly, the big three produce hype, but One Piece manages to stay strategically grounded the longest. With that, we will wrap up today's video on why One Piece was destined to be the best among the big three. The longevity and eventual payoff alone give it big dog status. Leave a comment down below with your favorite pick from the big three, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you don't, I will reach through the screen and give you a nuggie!